The Kingdom of the Lombards. Only one general's option, the Gestalt Guardsman general. He can put the hurt on infantry units, but he won't do too well against enemy cavalry because he is a sword cav unit. You have levy spears, standard spears, and in my opinion completely useless guardsmen because they are too expensive. They have nice stats, melee attack on the low side, charge is decent but not great, and you're just spending like the tactical flexibility that you get from having 4 spearmen is just superior to having a single guardsman. So these two units, levy spears and standard spears, do the job. The job is of course supporting cav fights, chasing skirmishers, absorbing charges. Now for melee infantry they have a unique unit. The Lombards have clubmen, and the attack against infantry of 10, the increase isn't that great, considering the melee damage is only 20 and the AP is down to 1. So there's a bit of inconsistency in the rule sets between these games in the mechanics, because in Rome 2 the club would come with a bonus against infantry, but also it would come with a nice armor penetrating value. That was removed in Attila, so these guys are almost completely useless in supporting cav engagements, but that's not as important in Charlemagne as it was in Attila. The thing is, if you put these guys in shield wall, they now have a 20%. They now have a 20 attack against infantry, and that boosts their melee attack up to 62 for the cheapest unit here, and up to 66 for the Lombard clubmen. Very, very high. Their melee defense isn't that great, so they're not the ideal shield wall unit, but they are very cheap, and they can defeat swords in shield wall. Swordsmen, cheap, standard swordsman. Gestalt swordsman, standard, relatively cost-effective swordsman. They also have some axes, and levy axemen, the Lombard axemen, very vulnerable to cav charges, very vulnerable to missiles, but they can do a lot of damage on the charge. You have levy archers, standard archers, levy skirmishers, standard skirmishers. Not much point in bringing the standard skirmishers over the levy skirmishers. You get a bit more morale, but the amount of missile damage and ammunition is the same. Now for melee cavalry, you have the Lombard horsemen, a nice little cav unit, very vulnerable, but can support cav fights well enough. The Gestalt cavalry, unfortunately, they have swords and they are very expensive, and the same goes for the Gestalt Knights. They do have 50 melee damage, they do have an excellent missile block chance, but still, they are sword cav. For skirmish cav, we have Knight Raiders and Raider cav, and the main difference between those two units is that the Knight Raiders have a higher melee defense, a bit more armor. The difference between these units isn't that great. Certainly not enough to warrant the price increase. So I'm going to be bringing Raider cav in most instances. So with the Lombards, you sort of have to make a decision whether to go for clubs, swords, because the Lombards can bring a lot of cheap stuff. The Lombards can bring a bunch of infantry, but that infantry is going to be very vulnerable, and it's going to need help from the cavalry. And I also didn't mention the Lombard Lancers. The Lombard Lancers, a very, very nice unit, if used correctly. So they can do a lot of damage quickly to enemy cavalry. They can do a lot of damage when rear charging with their 105 charge bonus, but with a 2 melee defense and 10 armor, this is not a unit you want to be having in engaged melee for too long. That could be a problem. So the Lombards can bring a lot of cavalry depending on the rules you're playing under, and they can bring a sturdy melee line. But I mean, a line of swords together with some supporting axes can be very nice. Now you're going to be relying on your cavalry to take out enemy skirmishers, you're going to be relying on the swords to hold the center, and the axes to support some cav fights. You could even bring in additional spear unit. With the Lombards, you can also bring skirmishers, because you have a lot of cavalry to protect those skirmishers. But since you have a lot of cavalry, I like to emphasize on that cavalry when playing as the Lombards, because the Lombards are one of the few factions that has access to these very cheap shock cav units, and they can be very dangerous, especially late game. So with the Lombards, they don't really excel in any one category. Their clubmen can potentially be powerful because they are so cheap. They can be used as mainline infantry, as very cheap mainline infantry. But if you do that, then you absolutely have to make sure that you win the cav fight decisively, because the Lombard clubmen, they are going to die to missiles. They do a reasonable job in shield wall, but there are quite a few units that can defeat them in shield wall. So you're getting cheap, relatively cheap, cost-effective infantry with the Lombards. You're getting cheap, cost-effective cavalry units, but you also get a very fragile army if you decide to go with the horsemen and the Lombard Lancers, the Raider Cav, some axemen, and some Lombard clubmen. In this case, you're basically you basically only have 10 armor on most of your units, and that makes the Lombards one of the more fragile factions. However, you can of course choose to go for the Gestalt swords, and you can go for Gestalt cavalry instead of the standard horsemen. But then, as you can see, you have to make some sacrifices, and when you go for these more expensive units, then your army shrinks with each choice you make. But it's entirely possible to make a Lombard army like this work. I just prefer the cheap Lombard rush armies to the more expensive elite armies, because the Gestalt cavalry is a very problematic unit to use. I much prefer having 2 units of horsemen to having 1 unit of Gestalt cavalry. Strength and honor.